Welcome to Polar Opposites. My name is Justin Conder. A few years back, a guy by the name of Lynn G. Robbins gave a devotional that I will never forget. The devotional was on being 100% responsible. In his devotional, Robbins recounts the story of his time working at a company. As a part of the company, he was in charge of overseeing a distribution center. There were these two guys who were working underneath him who he delegated out responsibilities for supplies and different things that the company would need in order to function. The issue is that they were having a lot of problems in these specific areas, but the two guys that were underneath Robbins never seemed to be at fault for anything. For example, other divisions within their company would mislabel or misprint order forms that were necessary for their shipments. The freight companies would deliver things late. The guidebooks that they were in charge of printing off would come shipped with errors in them. These things were inexcusable. And it was getting to the point where Robbins was going to have to make some very serious decisions on the future of these two employees. They nearly lost $1 million account. The head company owner was getting really fed up with these mistakes and told Robbins, you need to fix this. So instead of letting go of these two employees and terminating them, which he didn't think was going to be a good solution, he decided to start an incentive program. He said, all right, you're going to get a bonus if everything goes according to plan. If there's any confusion, if there's any errors that are made within our system, you are not going to get your bonuses. These two guys felt like, well, that's not fair, because what if, for example, the other divisions, they misprint forms and mess up the orders? And he told them, you're not going to get your bonus. Well, that's not fair, because what if the freight company doesn't ship the order on time? You're not going to get your bonus. And they said, well, that's not fair. What if the guidebooks that we're responsible for printing off come with errors in them? He said, you are 100% responsible, and you will not get your bonus if any of these errors keep occurring. This experiment ended up being a wild success, and here's why. The errors stopped. There was no more issues because these two guys were taking responsibility. They were checking with the other divisions to make sure forms were filled out correctly, line by line. They were checking with the freight companies and even ordering things early to make sure that things would get there on time. They were making sure that the guidebooks didn't have the errors, and if they did, they would have enough time to get them reshipped. They were consistently getting those bonuses, and they, more importantly, proved a very valuable lesson. That being 100% responsible is entirely up to you. One of the underrated and unnoticed lessons from this story is not about these two guys taking responsibility. It's about Robbins himself taking responsibility for these people that were underneath him. He realized that he didn't want to terminate these people because deep down inside, I believe, he thought that he was at fault. He knew that the errors and mistakes landed on his shoulders as the one who was in charge. Let's say that you end up becoming a manager for a company that has been running smoothly for many years, hasn't had many hiccups. One of their managers retires one day, and you get put in charge. If the employees start to become angry, if they stop working, if they start picketing with their signs out in front of the office building, if they start to misbehave, who's that going to reflect poorly on? The employees or you? Probably both. But it's not as though a company owner is going to come up to you and you're going to say, it's not my fault that they are out there being so upset. It's not my fault that they're out there picketing and protesting against me. It's not my fault that things are not getting run smoothly as they were before. You can't hide behind those kinds of mistakes if you're a bad leader. And how many milliseconds would it take a good company to terminate you? Believe it or not, you're not a manager. You are a company owner. You are overseeing the managers that are running things. You are on a very powerful committee that decides who the most powerful men and women in the world are going to be. And every November, you get to decide who gets terminated and who gets hired. Voting is how we keep our political leaders in check. That's how we decide who goes and who gets terminated. It is how we run our country. Believe it or not, we're very aware of what a good leader is and what a good leader isn't. A good leader doesn't use divisive language that pulls us apart and makes us hate each other. Instead, they unify us. They make us feel as though we are a part of the community. A good leader takes responsibility when things get out of hand, and a good leader will refrain from using excuses. On the contrary, we know that the opposite is true of poor leaders. They will make those excuses. They will blame others. They will find a way to avoid being responsible. We've seen some of that in a lot of our political figures today, even our president. But one of the worst offenders isn't our president today, but our previous president, number 45, Mr. Donald Trump. I know this is going to sound very harsh to a lot of my Republican friends, but Donald Trump didn't take responsibility for what happened on January 6th. He wasn't responsible beforehand, and he wasn't responsible after the fact. And to say that he wasn't responsible, that's the nice way of putting it. After all of the January 6th committee laying out their evidence, showing what actually happened, it is absolutely giving him the benefit of the doubt to just say that he was a poor leader and that he was not being responsible. Myself and others may feel much stronger about what happened on January 6th. But even if we ignore all the scandals, all the other things that happened during 2016 and 2020 in the presidency, even if we remove Mr. Trump from being directly correlated to those attacks, is that the kind of person that you want to be running our country? Somebody who's going to make excuses, somebody who's not going to be at fault, but find a scapegoat and blame others for what happened. The Capitol attack was so horrendous that even being a leader who's indirectly correlated with it is enough to tarnish your political reputation. That's why so many Republicans have started to back off and to abandon Trumpism. That's why so many of them are leaving and going to other Republican candidates for president. They don't want to have somebody who's associated with that dark day. My Republican friends, don't you want a better leader? Don't you want better leadership in general? Wouldn't it be nice to have somebody who is 100% responsible, who is going to own up to mistakes, but who is also going to take the extra effort to make sure that those mistakes don't happen? Don't you want a leader who's going to move you forward and help you to create bigger and better things for your future. Isn't that what you would want? I want to express my deepest disappointment with the Republican Party. I grew up Republican. I've spent so much time around Republican people. And as a party, they have not taken full responsibility for what happened on January 6th. How can I, as a centrist voter, support anybody who's affiliated with a party like that? How am I supposed to step up to the ballot box and cast a vote for someone who's affiliated with a group of people who attacked the nation's capital? Sure, maybe they're not the ones who did it. Maybe they wish it hadn't happened, but that's not enough. We need to be taking responsibility for our actions. Now, I just want to take a pause for just a second because I felt it was important to discuss how we can approach people who don't have the same political ideologies as ourselves. It's really difficult because there are people, even good people in our lives, who don't have good ideologies. They don't have good information, and they're, worse yet, spreading some false narratives around our country. Our human brains are wired in such a way that if somebody were to approach us and directly attack us for our political beliefs, it's likely that we're going to double down on those beliefs, whether they're right or whether they're wrong. So it's important to know, how do I approach a family member or a good friend who I disagree with? And I've come up with a few different tactics that you can use to make those conversations less stressful and better and more meaningful. Number one, try to stay calm when you are in the middle of a political disagreement. It can be very tempting to get anxious or to get passive aggressive or even angry in one of those emotionally charged moments. If somebody is discussing something that you deeply disagree with politically, it is so easy to be upset with them. Don't be. If you show that anger, they are definitely going to double down and become even more firm in that belief. It's better to pause, take a deep breath, and re-enter the conversation with a clearer mind. I was a part of a lobbying workshop up at the Utah State Capitol not too long ago. At this event, there was a workshop being conducted by a guy who was a lobbyist up on Capitol Hill. He was telling us about certain bills that he was legislating or trying to get passed, and one of the ones that was successful and had been successful that session got brought up. Somebody from the audience disagreed with him, and they started to yell and scream and get very anxious, and it ended up with them storming out of the room out of frustration. How much better would have that been if they had just taken a deep breath, relaxed, calmed down, and re-entered that conversation? Which brings us to point number 2. It's very important for us to not single these people out in a group. Talk privately to somebody who you disagree with. Now, if this person had instead said, I want to talk with you after we're done with this workshop and discuss political ideas, I'm sure that that conversation would have gone over much better. When you attack somebody publicly, they have to defend their reputation. You're going to put them in a very vulnerable spot. And of course, they've got to push back. What do you expect to happen? It's better to just pull your good friends, your family members aside, and have those conversations where you can have a better environment. And lastly, focus on the facts and not your opinions. It can be really tempting in those moments to say, okay, well, my opinion is blah, blah, blah. Don't do that. It's usually better if you're just presenting the factual evidence to these people rather than what you feel. Feelings can be reputed and you can definitely push back against that. But if you have facts, that's a little bit more difficult to argue with. And I would even go as far to say, try to find common ground with those facts. Facts that almost everyone in general society can agree on. If you find those kinds of factual evidences, then you will make a concrete case for why those people should change. And don't be upset if it doesn't happen right away, if people don't change right in that second. It takes time. People need to think about things, analyze things, and make slow improvements. We really need to stop alienating our Republican, Democrat, or other affiliated friends for what they believe. Making someone feel bad for their political beliefs is rarely the solution. Usually it starts with us analyzing ourselves, seeing what kind of cognitive dissonance do I have? What incorrect assumptions have I jumped to? Once we've figured out what our blind spots are, it's a lot easier to help other people. And again, remain calm. Make sure to correct people in private and focus on what is factual. And as we look inwards, and as I look inwards, doesn't matter if we voted Republican, Democrat, some other party, or didn't vote at all. Something that we need to realize is that each and every one of us is responsible for what happened on January 6th. Instead of blaming others and hiding from responsibility, it's important that each of us own up to our own faults. I am responsible for the January 6th attacks. I acted too passively during those times. I alienated too many of my Republican friends. I caused tension and anger and frustration. I could have done better. And I'm sure that you could have done better as well. We can either act helpless and surrender our power and responsibility, or we can own up to our faults. Each and every one of us is capable of changing and becoming a little bit better. A little bit better each and every day would go so far for our society. Don't blame others and surrender your control. Take responsibility. Don't make excuses. Make a commitment to do better. That's not to say that any single person could have stopped the January 6th attack on the Capitol. But we each could have done more to be helpful during that hard time. The attackers should be held responsible for what they did. But to a lesser extent, so should we all. We are very fortunate that the January 6th attacks were not worse than they were. This is a wake-up call for us all to be better, to act more responsible, and to take better care of our nation. Because the next time, and I pray that there is not a next time, we may not get that third chance. So, what are you going to do to become a better leader? Will you take more responsibility? Ultimately, you get to decide our fate. Thank you for joining me here on Polar Opposites. It's always a privilege to have you on. Thank you so much for your support in this community. Please continue to support by subscribing to this channel and sharing it with family and friends. And like always, when you learn better, do better. We'll see you next time.